What about these Hungarian national? I know the leader of Hungary recently made a statement. I think this was yesterday. Leader of Hungary made a
Yeah.
statement. What?
Yeah.
What
It
would
makes you wonder.
Well, no. What would Ukraine have to gain, okay, by sending a lot of ethnic Hungarian people to die? If that's what's happening,
Ethnic cleansing.
of course,
Ethnic cleansing. Yeah,
that's like
in my view, it absolutely is happening, and it has. But yeah, it would be a cleansing effort
like
by
that's a
Nazis,
hell of a statement.
basically.
Like that's crazy.
Yeah. It's crazy that if the Hungarian government is announcing it, and they're a member of NATO, if they're announcing it, that means they believe it. And I believe it too, and I'm not an idiot. I looked into a lot of sources about this. And my interpretation is that in Kherson Front, when there was the so-called Kherson offensive, that they were putting Nazi backing units behind the 128th Mountain Brigade, which was a forcible conscripted unit from Zakarpattia, which is another term for Transcarpathia. In April, there was protests by women that the men were being put into the 128th and not into the Turpat Battalion. They knew that this was happening. They knew that that unit was going to get sacrificed as cannon fodder. And if you go and look at some of the Euromaidan news from earlier, there is a constant paranoia that Hungary is backing Zakarpattia to split off from Ukraine and rejoin Hungary, which it used to be part of, with the 10-12% ethnic Hungarian minority there. And this is an obsession, second only to the Donbass and Crimea obsessions of the Ukrainian nationalists, that the Zakarpattians will leave and join Hungary. Now, however real you think that threat is, doesn't matter. The extreme nationalists do believe it's a real threat, and they have crushed and attacked and repeatedly suppressed any attempt at any kind of autonomy or recognition or help from Hungary into Zakarpattia. So the setup is all there for the motive for an ethnic cleansing. And then when you look in April and see that these conscripts are thrown in this battalion, do a web search, day of mourning in Transcarpathia for the 128th Mountain, which got slaughtered in the so-called Kherson offensive. Now, why? Now, when the Russians countered that Kherson offensive, there's a town there on the right bank of Kherson called, I forget the name of it, but its initials are SS, which I find hilarious and ironic. That little town with the initials SS had the Nazi backing troops in it that were shooting the retreating conscript troops from the front. Well, the Russians went as light as they could on those conscripts and tried to capture them and not kill them, but they sent Tu-95 strategic bombers to erase that little SS town from the absolute map. They risked strategic bombers to kill everything alive in that town. So that tells you the Russians know exactly what's going on. The Russians are doing their very best to target Nazi backing troops and command, and not to target sucker conscripts welded into tanks, which is a crazy story that I don't know if it's true, but it's out there. Yeah. And I think in those cases, it's realistic to expect that you would see deaths or losses on the range of 20-1, right? Like, it would be normal to see that in a formal assault by conscripts against experienced troops, when the conscripts are deliberately given shit weapons, when they're deliberately have guns at their back and all they're trying to do is surrender or hide, and then you're being pounded by artillery like the Russians have. Yeah, you could easily see 20-1 in that situation. So this is the kind of thing that elevates the Ukrainian casualties catastrophically high. Now, it would also explain why they would want to hide that, right? Because even though it would make them look in more desperate need of West help, the fact that they would sacrifice minority troops makes them look very bad. And it's the usual tit for tat. They claim the Russians are doing this to Dagestanis, for instance. But you don't see the same kinds of protests in Dagestan as you see in Transcarpathia months in advance.
The counter to that would simply be they're crushing the protests, right?
Sure. But they trust the protests in Transcarpathia too, but they were still reported in Russia-friendly media.
There were protests in Dagestan after mobilization, but I think some people...
How long did they last, though? I'm not saying they didn't happen.
Yeah, that happened, but some people found proof that they were backed by Ukraine or something, like in
Hmm?
Telegram. I'm not sure about that. I didn't like fully research it, but some people found proof of it.
Well,
They
okay,
they
but
lasted
you could
for like a
also
week or so.
you would also reasonably claim that Russia or Hungary could have backed the people in Transcarpathia who cares, because this is the actual relatives and friends of the people being sent to be slaughtered. Now, I think in the case of the Dagestan, that the Dagestani Chechen conflict is more at fault there. In other words, the Dagestanis kind of fear that they'll be put into battle where Chechens get to push them into the front line. The same as the ethnic Hungarians are worried that they don't want to be pushed in the front line by a bunch of Banderites from Lviv, right? So this is more of a localized issue in both countries that has more to do with worry about who's really in charge and who's really going to get them killed. That neither case indicates that all ethnic minorities in the country fear becoming ethnic cleansed. And we all know that the minority that's going to get ethnic cleansed from Ukraine is going to be the Russian Orthodox minority, which is what they say. If you identify with Russia, go to Russia and don't take your land. We're taking your land, and I think personally, the biggest barrier to peace is this ongoing claim to Crimea. Crimea is 80-90% Russian Orthodox. It's special in that it had autonomy for ages. And the only real issue there is the Crimean Tatars ought to have a little more autonomy and special rights. But that could be negotiated. And the other issue is the Black Sea resources. But you can negotiate that too with money. You don't have to genocide anybody to solve those problems.
Speaking of like the ethnic cleansing and of the Hungarian population in Ukraine, what's the difference there? And then the fears of like possible, like would the Chechens ethnically cleanse Dagestan? Would they do that? Is that something that would be, I don't know?
No, but the Dagestanis feel that if they're in a war and military age trained Dagestanis are junior in seniority to the experienced Chechen troops that Putin relies on quite a lot, that they would end up in the position of the ethnic Hungarians, shoved into the front with Chechens behind them with guns at their backs, gleefully willing to shoot them in the back, because it just means less Dagestanis in case of a future conflict. Now, I'm not going to say there is ethnic cleansing of Hungarians going on, but it's very notable that the Hungarian government is saying that there is, right? Even if they don't believe it and they're just saying it as a political trick, that's a political trick to get Transcarpathia.
What gain would the Hungarian government get if that's true, though?
They'd get
Ukraine can't pay them
when
back.
Ukraine
can't. You can't get punished for it.
Yeah, it can't. It just loses Zakarpattia in the inevitable breakup of Ukraine. When Zakarpattia goes back to Hungary, when Galicia and Volhynia go back to Poland, which they were in prior to 1939, maybe Bessarabia goes back to Romania. These are all places that were kept by Stalin after World War II. And we broke Stalin's borders when we didn't accept Putin taking Crimea. That was Putin restoring Stalin's border, which had Crimea in Russia. We could have stopped it there, but if we're going to reject Stalin's border, we're going to end up rejecting all of Stalin's borders. And that means also the 5 oblasts or so in the west of Ukraine will go back to Poland, go back to Hungary, go back to Romania, maybe Slovakia, depending on which history year you want to roll back to.